Dagan. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at ABC Research Laboratories. Thanks for joining us today. We have a good group. Today we'll be going over menu labeling and its effect on restaurant chains. We're going to kind of talk about what's been going on in the news with the Affordable Care Act, and then we'll go through an explanation of what the draft guidance states and how it looks right now, and that can kind of give everybody an idea of what the final guidance will look like from the FDA. So just to give a little bit of background before we start, ABC Research Laboratories is a third-party independent ISO-accredited testing lab. We're based in Gainesville, Florida, but we do business all over the U.S. and the Caribbean and a little bit of Canadian business as well. I've been with the company since 2004, and as the Chief Scientific Officer, I represent the company on technical matters, whether it's doing webinars like this, or it's talking to clients and consulting, or it's or being a technical support to our non-technical sales staff. So it's my pleasure to do webinars like this. Our clients have found them very, very beneficial. So I hope you enjoy today, and I hope you get a lot of good information. During the broadcast, if you do have a question, you do have the ability to raise your hand and to chat in a question. So please feel free to do that, and hopefully I can stop and we can address some things along the way, and then we'll also have time for questions at the end in case you want to save them till then. I will also be joined by Lori Stevens, who is our Business Development Director over restaurants. Lori just joined ABC after 13 years with the Dagan Corporation, and she has a lot of great ideas for the restaurant industry from all of her experience, and she'll be on at the end to kind of introduce herself and also help answer questions. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so on March 23rd of 2010, we saw the President sign into effect the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And of course, we've heard a lot about this recently in the press as well. What's interesting about that, everybody thinks about that as universal health care. Well, there is a very specific section, Section 4205, that addresses specifically nutritional labeling for restaurant chains. This section would require that restaurants and other retail food establishments that have 20 or more locations operating under a same or similar name to actually list calorie counts next to menu items on their menu. Now, this could be a menu that a guest would have at a sit-down restaurant. This would also apply to menu boards if you have kind of a walk-up ordering system, and it also applies to menu boards that are in drive-thrus. In addition, if you have a buffet, we'll talk about that as kind of a specific instance, but imagine having calorie counts that are sitting next to each of the entrees on the buffet. The proposed rule outlines not only in enforcement by the FDA, but also kind of what you need to do to be compliant, and we'll talk about that as well. When the FDA originally put out this draft guidance, they did have a comment period under which anyone could comment about the guidance, good or bad. And interestingly enough, this set of regulations is something that the National Restaurant Association actually has worked quite closely with the FDA in drafting, just so there's one universal rule for restaurants to follow. You can imagine how frustrating it must be to have restaurants, maybe some in San Diego, some in New York, some in Florida, where if we don't have some type of nationwide regulation, you may be asked to provide different pieces of data in different parts of the U.S., and that would be even more difficult for restaurants to comply with. So this again, is a nationwide regulation. Moving forward, we saw, the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act question over the last several months, or over a year, actually since it was probably signed into law. 2 weeks ago, on June 28th, the Supreme Court actually finally released their opinion that the act would be upheld in its current form. This means that the FDA, under the Affordable Care Act, actually has the power to go ahead and draft final regulations and put those into effect on menu labeling. The word on the street, as of right now, is that we will probably see the final guidance in November of this year. I've also heard some rumors that it's probably going to be later November after the election that we'll see this final guidance. But again, we'll keep our eyes and ears open, and we'll be disseminating all types of information once we have that final guidance for you guys. Now let's go through some of the basics of the proposed rule. So who's going to be covered? This regulation would cover any restaurant with 20 or more locations. There are some exclusions from the regulation: movie theaters, bowling alleys, or any other place where food might be sold that their primary business activity is not as a restaurant. So you could imagine maybe a putt-putt golf course has a snack bar, but that's not their primary business activity. So those folks would be exempt. But again, restaurants that have 20 or more locations operating under a same or similar name would be required to have these calorie counts on the menus. So again, we need a calorie count for standard menu items, and also a succinct statement of suggested caloric intake must also be on the menu. And FDA has given examples of this in the draft guidance, and I'm sure there will be a couple of versions of the succinct statement that you can use on your menus in the final guidance as well. Additionally, the restaurant chain must provide even more detailed nutritional information to guests on the premises. Now, this could be either in a take-home brochure. I have a feeling that you will be allowed to show it in electronic form as well, maybe at a kiosk or some type of interactive menu. And that would be, the additional information would be things like fat, calories from fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, protein, dietary fiber, sodium. So pretty much, you know, you have to show calorie count on the menu next to the menu item, but in some other place accessible to customers, you have to be able to provide pretty much the rest of the nutritional facts panel that you'd see on like a retail product. The only thing that you as restaurateurs that you do not have to provide that is provided on a retail package, you can go ahead and skip vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, and iron. Those are not required for restaurants, but all of the other nutritional facts are. As far as compliance, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, food that is not labeled will be considered misbranded. So there are two ways to get in trouble with the FDA, and this is for anybody producing food. You can either have a product that's misbranded or a product that's adulterated. Adulterated product contains something deleterious to health, so it's not safe. In some way, shape, or form, it's going to hurt somebody. A misbranded product usually has something wrong on the label or is missing a piece of information. So you can see why not putting your calorie count on your menu would result in a misbranded charge from the FDA, because you'd be missing that caloric information. The FDA in the proposed rule did not speak specifically on penalties, but again, we'll talk a little bit at the end about how they've handled penalties for retail producers in the past. Now, we said calorie count is required for a standard menu item, so let's talk about how the FDA defined a standard menu item. These would include food that's routinely listed or offered as a self-service food. So anything that's usually on your menu, or if you have a walk-up cold case or somebody can kind of grab a sandwich and go, anything that you offer routinely in that cold case would count as a standard menu item. Again, and food on display, which would be a buffet offering. This would also include specific types, like let's say you have a pizza restaurant where you may have different toppings for different pizzas. If you do list specific pizzas, like let's say you have a meat lover's pizza or you have a veggie deluxe pizza, because you've denoted those specifically on the menu, those would also count as standard menu items. So you would have to give a calorie count for the meat lovers or for the veggie deluxe, because you've kind of titled those and you have those specifically on your menu as a separate offering. Now, when we start talking about pizzas, you can imagine people's heads going, oh gosh, how many combinations of toppings could there possibly be? Well, that also spurs the discussion of what do we do with combination meals where I could have French fries or I could have onion rings as my side, or if we have a variable menu item where, you know, I could add mayonnaise to my burger, or maybe I'd like my burger without mayonnaise. Those will also be defined in the final rule, and depending on how they're listed on your menu, I think it's going to have the greatest impact on what type of information you have to give alongside those items on the menu. We'll talk about some specifics about that at the end. Now, what type of items will be excluded? So items that are not listed on a menu board would be excluded. So let's say soy sauce sitting on the table at a sushi restaurant, you would not have to include. Other items placed on the table or counter for general use, so again, soy sauce, ketchup, mustard, if those are items that sit on your tables routinely. Daily specials do not have to be included, and temporary menu items. So if you have a limited time offering that's less than 60 non-consecutive days on the menu, you can actually exclude that item. And then again, you are, of course, allowed to do market tests on new items to try those out in all or in some of your locations. And if they've been less than 90 days on the menu, those are also excluded. Interestingly enough, alcoholic beverages were also excluded in the proposed rule, but I have a feeling those may end up being included in the final rule. So that's just something to think about and something to look for when we see the final guidance. Okay, and I just want to let everybody know, I just got a message that Lori Stevens has joined us. So I'm going to let Lori just go ahead and quickly introduce herself and kind of give a little background, and then we'll get back to the basics of the proposed rule.
Thanks, Gillian. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Stevens. I'm new to the ABC research team and really excited about working with all these very, very bright people. But I have come from the restaurant industry. I had 11 and a half years with Darden Restaurants. They were a good 11 and a half years, but I'm excited about spreading my wings a little bit and learning more about other parts of the food business. But I am hopefully going to be a resource to all of our friends in the restaurant industry as we move into nutritional labeling. We do quality verifications, any of those things that ABC can help with. I think I might be able to be a resource and a sounding board and someone who can help bring solutions to the table. So that's my goal, being on the team here at ABC.
Great, thanks, Lori. And as I told everybody at the beginning, Lori will be on here for the rest of the webinar, and then we'll both field some questions at the end from the group. So, all right, so back to the basics of the proposed rule. Let's talk about how specific you need to be and what kind of accuracy the FDA expects in this data. So for the proposed calories to be posted on the menu, what the FDA would like to see, they're akin to the retail food guidelines where they do allow some rounding. So they want to see calories listed at 5-calorie increments up to and including 50 calories. And then once you get over 50 calories, which most dishes will be way over 50 calories, you can go ahead and round to the nearest 10-calorie increment. Again, when we talk about combination meals and variable menu items, there were 3 different options actually listed for combination meals and variable food items. One was to have an average calorie listing for that item. There was another to have a range for combination meals and variable food items, and the other was to list, well, you can list as many of those combinations as you'd like. Probably the most common and what I think we're going to see in the final rule is to go ahead and list a range for a variable menu item. So you could imagine if you have a grilled chicken sandwich, if I got my grilled chicken sandwich with no mayo, no cheese, and I got apple slices as my side, that's going to be probably a lower calorie version than me getting the chicken sandwich with extra mayo, extra cheese, black olives, and a side of fries. So you could imagine for that entree with the different options of toppings you could have, or maybe sides that you could choose from, or even sizes that you could choose from for that meal, you would probably have a fairly large range. So again, I think it's going to be very much based on how your menu is printed and then the option you choose that the FDA gives you. Now, talking specifically about that, not only do when we test for folks, we give data back, we can also advise you on what your options are, maybe some creative ways to list your items where it'll make good sense to the consumers and it won't be too much information where it's actually overwhelming. So we're here to help you guys with that as well. And again, FDA did take suggestions on statements for caloric intake on menus. We may even see other options when the final guidance does come out. All right, and this is kind of what I talked about at the beginning, that additional information that they want to see you have available for someone. Needs to list calories, calories from fat, total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrates, dietary fibers, sugars, and protein. So again, it's pretty much rounds out that complete picture of the entree for the guest, good and bad traits about foods included. Now, we talked a little bit about proposed nutrients on pizzas and other items where you can have a variety of different toppings. One option that the FDA did give for menu items like that was to go ahead and give a declaration of calories for the most basic version of that dish. So for a pizza, that would be like a plain, deep dish 12-inch pizza. You can imagine if you had nachos, you might just want to give the chips and the cheese sauce, or maybe just chips and salsa, and allow everybody else to go ahead and do the math in their head when they add their own toppings. So you would give the basic preparation of the pizza or the nachos, and then for all of those different toppings that the guests could choose from, you would give a serving size caloric value for each one of those. So it depending on how it's done, it can be done on a menu where it's not too cluttered. And again, it allows the guest to say, well, if I wanted to put guacamole on my nachos, I'd be adding 180 calories. If I wanted to put sausage on this pizza, I would be adding 220 calories. So it allows the guest to still customize whatever they would like to eat, and it allows you to show great variety in your menu and still comply with the regulations. FDA also, in the proposed rule, had the idea of allowing restaurateurs to list similar items in a group with the nutrients only listed once. So if you have, let's say, smoothies, where you're using the same smoothie base, so most of what's in the guest's cup is ice and this smoothie base that you purchase. And maybe the only thing that's different is a scoop of berries in your berry smoothie and a scoop of peaches in your peach smoothie. Obviously, the berries and the peaches are going to have a very small effect on the overall nutrient makeup of those items. So you may end up with a berry smoothie, a peach smoothie, and a pineapple smoothie that all have very, very similar nutritional profiles. For the sake of saving space on that menu, you could list the nutrient values once and say all three of these smoothies, are covered by these nutrient values. So it is space is going to be a big consideration. You can imagine space on a menu, but even more difficult is space on a menu board, or even especially at a drive-through. So they are trying to be considerate of space and accommodate restaurateurs in that way, where listing similar items together will help you save some space. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about buffets and food on display, because this is an interesting portion of the proposed rule. So for self-service, which would be a buffet, or food on display, which would be anything you can kind of walk up to a cold case and grab yourself, calories per item or per serving must be posted on a sign containing the item name and adjacent to the item. So you have an option. You can list the calories per serving or the calories per item. Now, let's take chicken tenders, for example. Let's say you had tenders on your buffet, and we would consider, for the sake of argument, a serving of chicken tenders as 3 tenders, let's say. That constitutes a serving. So I could either put the calories for the serving, which is 3 tenders, or I can put the calories per item. So I'm actually allowed to list calories for 1 tender because it is a discrete item on that buffet. And of course, the person has the option to either pick up 1, 2, 3, however many tenders they want. They don't actually have to pick up a complete serving on a buffet. So again, we've worked with a couple of different buffet customers already in saying, you know, let's take a look at the items on your buffet and how, you know, if you have tenders, if you have nuggets, if you have fish fillets, how big are the discrete pieces, and is it going to be better to post those per item or per serving? And we've helped them kind of work through those issues. Multi-serving items. So as you can imagine, the pizza people have some questions about, well, how many slices should there be in a medium pizza? Multi-serving items have been a very large part of the debate in the proposed rule. So a discrete item, such as a rotisserie chicken, the FDA would like to see a display of total calories, but you could have the option of putting in calories per serving as well. And then individual portions of a multi-serving food, so like cake by the slice, or in my opinion, like pizza, should be listed as calories per serving. So this gets interesting. How big is a serving of pizza? Again, how many slices do you get out of a pie? How many slices do you get out of a traditional cake? I think for the items that have rack values, and a rack value is a value put out by the FDA that's a recommended serving size for an item, I have a feeling the FDA will probably just kind of default to the rack values for retail items. But there are going to be some items that do not have a rack value, and I have a feeling those will be specifically outlined in the final guidance. All right, so let's talk a little bit about determination of nutritional content. There are a couple of different ways to do this, and the FDA actually listed multiple ones in the proposed rule, and I have a feeling this part of the proposed rule will probably look fairly similar when we see the final guidance. So you can determine nutrient content either by nutrient databases or by laboratory analysis. You can also use cookbooks, which is kind of akin to using a database. But the information provided must be on a reasonable basis. You know, so it has to come from a reliable source if you're going to use that information to calculate values for the purposes of complying with this regulation. Now, you'll notice on the slide that I have 2 sets of words in green, so nutrient databases and laboratory analyses. Let's go ahead and define these and kind of talk about the difference. When we say we're going to determine nutrient content by a database method, this would be me looking at an entree on your menu by its recipe or formulation only. So as you can imagine, let's say I have a salad and you show me exactly how many grams of lettuce, tomato, carrot, boiled egg, chopped up ham all go into creating this salad. I can go into a software program and add all of those ingredients together just as I would add them together if I was actually going to make the salad in a kitchen, and I can come up with a very good representation of nutrient values for that menu item. The other way to get nutrient data is by a laboratory analysis, and this is when you would actually submit the food item cooked ready to go, just in the form that you'd serve it to a guest in your restaurant. You would actually submit that to a food lab, and we do the physical and chemical extraction of the fat, determination of the protein, cholesterol, all of that. So we actually do the science on the food itself. Both of these are acceptable methods to the FDA, and in the next slide we're going to talk a little bit about when you should use a database and when you should use a laboratory analysis. They're both appropriate methods, but only when they're used on specific classes of foods. And then again, FDA does mention a cookbook and labels on packaged foods. You know, if you're buying a ranch dressing that is a stock ranch dressing and it comes with a nutritional label, you can use that information on your menus as well. All right, so let's first talk about a database analysis. So I explained that it is just using the recipe or the formulation of the dish to create the nutrient determination. Now, think about salads, sandwiches, maybe mixing up a salad dressing or a fresh salsa. There are definitely dishes out there that completely are accurately represented by their formulation. You know, what I see on the recipe for the salad is exactly what I'm going to get in the dish. Compare that to, let's say, a chicken tender, where I may take the raw chicken, dredge it in egg, go ahead, bread it, and then when I'm going to fry it, yes, I know that I'm using oil, but of course all the oil that I would list in my recipe is not, all of it is not going to get absorbed onto that tender and then consumed by the guest. So some things, like salads and sandwiches and fresh sauces, are very, very well represented by their recipe, and some items are not, because you do see a lot of changes during cooking where some of the constituents in the recipe may not actually end up being consumed by the guest. And this is what you have to look at to make a good determination about what type of analysis you're going to use. For the items that we see large deviations from the recipe as far as what we see in the recipe and what the guest actually gets on their plate, or for items that we see a lot of changes during cooking, we do recommend a laboratory analysis. That's the only way you're going to get a very accurate representation of that food. Again, for this, you would be sending in the prepared menu item to a lab, and we do the physical breakdown on the sample. And this is going to take into account any changes during cooking. So if you have a steak that it's marinated, you're going to put it on the grill. Obviously, you're going to lose some moisture and some weight in that steak while you're grilling. You're definitely going to render off some of the fat. And if you have a marinade that contains salt, you're probably going to lose some of that marinade as well. So just thinking about those three attributes alone, your fat value is going to be different, your sodium value is going to be different, and you could actually end up having changes in other nutritional constituents just because you have that cooking yield. You know, a quarter-pound burger is a quarter-pound burger prior to cooking. It certainly isn't a quarter-pound after you cook it. So you can imagine just the weight loss in and of itself can have a big difference on what you'll see as a final nutrient determination. To give you a good example to think about and to share with other people when you're trying to talk to maybe your team members or your supervisor about how do you want to go about determining nutrient value. Let's talk about making hash browns. If you've ever gone in and you've eaten at a breakfast restaurant, you know, akin to, like, let's say a Waffle House, where you can see the griddle and you can see what everybody's doing in the kitchen, or maybe you make hash browns at home. You know that, you know, one, you have your shredded potatoes, and maybe they're seasoned up a little bit, and then you have your oil. So let's imagine you're standing at that flat top grill, and you're going to go ahead and you're going to ladle, let's say, 1/4 cup of oil onto the grill, and then you're going to go ahead and add your potatoes onto that and allow them to start to brown. You're going to flip them over, get that good golden brown color on the other side, and then you're going to remove them from the grill onto the plate, and that's what you're going to take to the dining room table and eat. So did all of that oil that you initially ladled onto the grill for cooking purposes actually make it onto your plate? No. Of course, some of it was absorbed by the potatoes, but we know if looking at that grill alone, you can still see oil residue on there. Same thing happens in a deep fat fryer. You know, you may have 5, 6, 10 gallons of oil in that deep fat fryer. Only a portion of that is absorbed into a deep fried food. So you can imagine what would happen if we just took that hash brown recipe where it says 1/4 cup of oil, X number of ounces of shredded potatoes. You could imagine how inaccurate that recipe analysis would be, because we don't have a clear idea of how much oil is actually picked up by the product and ends up on the guest plate. Even in estimating oil pickup, it's hard to do because you have moisture loss and oil uptake all at the same time. So it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what's happening in the system. For a product like this, I would suggest doing a laboratory analysis so you know that you're only accounting for what goes on the guest plate. You can imagine if you did account for all of that oil that you saw on your recipe card, your calorie count would be much, much higher, and your fat would be much, much higher than if you actually just looked at what food is going to go on the guest's plate and is actually going to end up in the guest's mouth. So there are some very specific menu items that function perfectly fine for a database. If you have a salad, a sandwich, those are great representations of their actual recipe. However, a lot of menu items, because of frying, because of grilling, sauteing, you see big differences in calories and fat, especially, and even sometimes sodium, reported by a database versus a laboratory analysis. So I always like to make that differentiation. The hash browns is a great story to pass on, and it gives a very good visual representation of what's going on. Like, wait a second, that grill's really greasy and I didn't eat that. Why should I have to count those calories? Well, you don't. You just want to make sure you do items like that by a full lab analysis. All right, let's talk a little bit about expected compliance. We did talk about that you can round the calories that are going to be seen on the menu. Let's talk about a little bit of the additional nutritional information that the FDA is going to expect that you have available for customers. Protein and dietary fiber must be at least as high as the declared value. So as you can imagine, protein and dietary fiber, the more the merrier. But they don't want you to overstate those good values. So the value in the actual dish has to be as high, if not higher, than the declared value that you're publishing for your guests. Calories, sugars, total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, and sodium, all the scary things in the nutrient label, must be no more than 20% in excess of the declared value. So again, they don't want you artificially putting out their low values so your menu looks healthier than it really is. These are akin to the same rules that retail food products are held to. The FDA really did not give a break for restaurants, which is actually a little bit scary if you think about it. There's a lot of variation in the back of the house. My dollop of sour cream may not be the same size as your dollop of sour cream, and no matter how well you train your folks, there's always going to be variation in the back of the house. We actually do a second webinar. We'll do a second webinar a week from today about risk mitigation and nutritional labeling, and we actually cover all of the things that you can do to kind of make sure you are compensating for the variation that we know is just inherent in restaurant food. So you can actually make these plus or minus 20% values. Again, proteins, carbohydrates, and dietary fiber must be no less than 80%. So again, it's plus or minus 20%. What you're saying is in there, better be in there, at least within plus or minus 20%. For combo meals, for variable meals, if you're going to go with the option of stating a caloric range, the lowest value would be used for compliance. So think about it this way. If we go back to the example of the chicken sandwich, and I'm going to go the really healthy route. I just want chicken, lettuce, and tomato. I don't want cheese. I don't want mayonnaise. I want my apple slices instead of French fries, that's going to be probably the healthiest option I could do with that sandwich and that side. Because it's kind of a marketing claim at that point that you do have this low-cal option, FDA is going to look at that value to make sure you're compliant. When they're looking at your value for the deep-fried, extra cheese, extra mayo, large side of fries, chicken entree, they're going to give you a little bit of leniency because, again, they expect it to be a higher value. It really isn't behooving you to be inaccurate with that menu item. All right, so we've kind of finished up just the general proposed rule. What's going on with the Affordable Care Act? Again, it was upheld, so that signals to the FDA, keep working on the final regulation. Hey, FDA, you do have the power to enforce this regulation. And that final guidance we do expect to see in November of this year, probably mid to late November is what I'm hearing. And hopefully this kind of gave you a look at the proposed rule. The proposed rule will, I expect small changes. I don't expect large changes. So I think a lot of what we talked about today will hold true in November. And again, next week, we kind of do part 2 of this webinar where we're going to talk about mitigation of risk, like how, you're putting a lot of information out there. And when you put information out to the general public, somebody's going to question it. Somebody's going to double check you on your analysis. We've seen a lot of sensationalistic news stories like that, where people will go in and kind of secret shop you and make sure that the values are accurate. So that's what we're going to handle in part 2 of the webinar. And again, it's a week from today, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. After this webinar, I know that our marketing manager is also going to email out, and he just chatted to everybody, the registration address if you want to go ahead and register for next week as well. So at this point, Lori and I would be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. You can go ahead and do the raise your hand function on GoToWebinar and type in your message and we'll get to it. So I'll give you guys just a minute to do that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and we have one coming in. So, all right, this panel or this attendee is asking, what can I be doing now to prepare for this law's implementation? I would say sitting in on today's webinar was a great idea. You kind of got debriefed on what the proposed rule looks like. Other than that, go back and look at your menu for now. Look and see how many items you have, how many different variable menu items you have, and just start to do the research on what your options are. Today we talked about there being 2 different ways to determine nutrient content, the database and the full laboratory analysis. Look through your menu and determine what items you think you can do by database analysis. Those are going to be less expensive to do. But again, you don't want that database analysis to over or underrepresent what's on your menu. For our clients, we actually do free menu reviews. So if you wanted to send in your menu, we'll go through and kind of highlight what items need to be done by database, what items need to be done by a full nutritional analysis. And that way, you can start to wrap your head around, how many items total you have, kind of get an idea of what the cost of implementation is going to be, and think about how you want to budget for this, and how you want to fit it into the timetable of also getting new menus printed, getting new menu boards constructed and up, training your staff on how to answer questions about this information, because there, of course, are going to be questions from guests when you put the information out there. So there's a lot to think about. And on that subject, one thing that we did not talk about is the implementation period. The original draft guidance actually only had a 6-month implementation period in it. I've never seen an FDA implementation period that short for anything. I really boggles my mind to know how the FDA actually came up with 6 months. This was a very hot topic when they asked for comments on the rule. People said this is outrageous. How are we supposed to get everything done in 6 months? I know that the NRA, working alongside the FDA, has pushed for at least a year for implementation. Now, a year sounds like a pretty long time. Keep in mind that, again, you're reprinting menus. You know, you're formatting menus with all of this new information, finding, you know, places to even hold all of this information, all these calorie counts and menus are going to be hard for some folks. So, you know, take the last couple of months off of that year-long timeline, because you're going to be dealing with the data. You might even want to change some menu items. We'll have menus reprinted, menu boards reconstructed. There's a lot to do to comply even after you determine all of your nutrient values. So that year is probably going to fly by for a lot of people.
Yeah, and Gillian, I would just add that the piece that is what you're presenting today, what we're talking about, really is the small part, right? So cooking up your menu items, getting them tested or getting them analyzed, and getting the data back is fairly straightforward. It's the part that getting prepared to get this information to the guest that's really the challenging part. So that I agree with you that the sooner you can start getting your ducks in a row, thinking about how we're going to utilize this information, really the better. Because once it comes time for testing, that's straightforward. You know, by then we'll have figured out together what's the right way to approach that. But again, it's all the behind-the-scenes stuff that's going to take some time.
Yeah, good point, Lori. All right, question. Okay, somebody's asking about how the FDA is going to handle shareable appetizers and desserts. I think this kind of goes back to the question that all the pizza folks have of, like, how many slices are in a medium pizza? For something like an appetizer, I know there's been discussion of, you know, all of your appetizers can be divided into portions based on the size of the appetizer. We all know that some appetizers are really meant to serve 3 and some are meant to serve 6. I have heard some discussion that you may need to list how many guests your appetizer serves. So if you want to put down, okay, well, it's 340 calories per serving, and this is meant to serve 6 guests. So people, if they're only splitting it among 3, you know, they can do that math and have an idea of what their personal intake is going to be. I don't, that wasn't really handled well in the proposed rule, but it was brought up in the comments, and that's definitely something that the FDA is going to have a definitive answer for in the final guidance. But I think, again, you have some options probably coming your way as far as how to list it. Okay, another question. What are the penalties if I don't comply? This is an interesting question. We talked a little bit about there are 2 ways to get in trouble with the FDA, either adulteration or misbranding, and foods that are not labeled or labeled incorrectly would be considered misbranded. For retail products, when you are selling a product that has something incorrect on the label or maybe is deficient, is missing a piece of information on the label, FDA does impose monetary fines or can actually prohibit you from selling that item. So you can imagine, I doubt the FDA is going to actually shut down a restaurant for non-compliance or incorrect compliance. However, they may fine you over the period of time it takes you to correct the issue. So imagine, you know, FDA comes in, spot checks some of your values, they find that one is wrong. Not only are you going to get fined that day, you may get fined additional days for however long it takes you to correct the value, and then you're going to end up either doing a menu reprint or putting stickers over that portion of the menu. You know, again, the food testing part's easy. It's all of the kind of the paperwork and you know, reconstructing menu boards and all of that, that really is going to be difficult and time-consuming for restaurateurs to keep up with. In the proposed rule, they did not specify penalties, but that will be part of the final rule, I can assure you.
So, Gil, I have a question for you. This is Lori. As,
sure.
Let's say, a restaurant that has a menu board posted, you know, say behind a cash register, and they're on a menu cycle of a new menu or new menu items every 6 months, twice a year. So when that's done, they just need to go in and test the new items that are coming up, right, and add that to the board or to the information that's presented to the guest, right? They're not going to need to go back and test the entire menu.
That's correct. So at the beginning, we touched on time periods for like limited time offers and stuff like that. If you were on a 6-month cycle with menu items, you would want to have information for all of those available when they're being sold. Now, once you've got your menu complete, and you know, let's say you add in a couple of dishes here or there, maybe for the holiday season, maybe for the summer, those are going to be, if they're going to be on your menu for more than 60 consecutive days, they will be considered at that point a standard menu item. So you would have to go through and complete testing on those, and again, have that information added into your menus, your menu boards, all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's something to consider. I know a lot of folks out there, they already have nutritional data for a large portion of their menu because it is such a hot topic with guests. You know, guests will ask for that information, or maybe you have a light fare portion of your menu that you have done already. You know, going back and redoing all of the data you already have may not be necessary. You may have to do some work if you're going to change serving sizes, or depending on what the final regulation states, if you don't have nutritional information based on the right serving size, you definitely may have to go back and do some work on those items. And then moving forward, any new items should be looked at. The only caveat I will give, again, if you're putting something under light fare, if you're putting something under the auspice of we have 8 dishes under 600 calories or less, if you have something that you're touting as, you know, low sodium or low calorie or low fat or high protein, if you're using any of those, any of the nutrient data as kind of a marketing claim or a draw for customers, I would make sure that I knew that those values were completely accurate and that I went back and I did spot check those on a routine basis. And by routine, I mean the minute you change a supplier for an ingredient, I would be checking to make sure that I understood any changes therein of the different ingredient. And I would also, even if you didn't change a supplier, you didn't change your recipe, you didn't change a serving size, if I was using that as a marketing claim, I would definitely go in at least twice a year and recheck at least the value for the marketing claim. I wouldn't tell you to rerun all of the nutritional data necessarily, but if you're saying it's low fat and you're saying it's low sodium, I would definitely have a recent, you know, within the last 6 months at least, test result on hand, because using things as a marketing claim, that's what the FDA is drawn to. That is a big red flag for those folks. Like, oh, you know, this is really giving this business a leg up. We want to make sure that they're not misbranding the item, you know, and misleading the public. And that's when it becomes a concern to the FDA. So the first thing I would want to have on hand if I was responsible for a chain's nutritional information is I would want recent lab results that, you know, when the FDA comes back and goes, well, yeah, I don't know, you said it was less than 600 calories and I got 615. You know, at that point, I want to be able to put lab results down and say, look, I had this checked less than 6 months ago. I have not changed my formulation. I have not changed the supplier. I have not changed an ingredient. You know, I've done my due diligence to be on top of, you know, my nutritional information, and here's the lab, you know, here's what I submitted for testing, and be able to show that to the FDA officer. just to at least have something on your side that says you're keeping up with your information and you use the best possible practices for that menu item. You know, in addition, we talked a little bit about choosing either a database analysis or a full lab analysis. I would be very hesitant to show an FDA officer a database analysis unless I was sure that I used it appropriately. That is a very, very easy thing to pick apart. If you showed me a database analysis for something that came out of a deep fryer, came off of the grill, I'd forget it. Right then and there, I would say, no, I'm going to recheck your work, and I'm going to do it by a full lab analysis. I know that is the ultimate and the most accurate way to look at this type of item. So again, it's about showing the FDA that you've done your research responsibly, and you've done your due diligence in putting this information out there for the public to use. All right, any last questions before we go? All right, well, I hope today was informative. It was a good start of the discussion. Again, next week, we will be talking about mitigation of risk in menu labeling at the same time, 2 o'clock Eastern. Please feel free to join us. You have the web address there for registration. In that webinar, we're going to go through, again, ways to sample your menu items, ways to put out the information to make sure that, again, when the FDA comes back and says, well, you know, I checked your prime rib, I'm not getting the same value you are. We're going to talk about exactly what your options are at that point and having the right information on hand where you can just put that issue to bed immediately. So I hope you all join us next week. Please feel free to forward that to any of your colleagues if they want to tune in for webinar number 2. And we do repeat this webinar pretty much on a monthly or maybe every other month basis. And we will continue to as we reach November and we see the final regulations coming out. So it was a pleasure doing this webinar today. You have my contact information as well from our website, foodtestingexperts.com. Please feel free to visit that site for updates on this and many, many other food testing issues. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.